great to be here to talk to you about this topic, and I think I'm probably the only journalist in the room. You're also a journalist? I'm a journalist. Okay, so we're two then. Great. So you might be able to corroborate what I'm saying or maybe criticize it, or
I will fact check you.
Fact check me. That's the thing. That's what we should do all the time. So yes, it's well, I've heard people like earlier today we heard some comments about the media, news media and journalists and how they're functioning. So and I recognized a lot about what you were talking about there. Maybe I can adjust it a little bit because I think that there is also ideas out there among people who are not journalists about why journalists are doing what they're doing that are perhaps not entirely true. I mean, you were, for instance, mentioning this left-wing bias, which is partly true, but it's not the whole story. It's not as simple as that. I think those polls are perhaps a little bit different today than they used to be. Anyway, and it's different in different countries. So yeah, my name is Anders Bolling, as you know, and I'm a freelance journalist now, and I'm a podcaster, and I write books sometimes. I've published 6 books, the latest of which is this one, Professional Media Coverage, which I wrote together with Sven-Olof Karlsson, another journalist, who's also a free thinker, and we have both have these. We have been critical towards the climate narrative for many years, and so it's back. It's on the table back there if you were interested in checking it out. So please do. And I also wrote a book some 15 years ago now called which in English would be translated to The Cozy Darkness of the Apocalypse, Apokalypsens gosiga mörker, which is basically about that the world is better than we think. And we heard, for instance, Carl, I think your name is Carl, isn't Dahl Madsen?
That's me. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there you are. Sorry, there you are.
It's okay.
You talked about these things yesterday, so I recognize a lot of what you said there. And that book was also, to a large extent, critical towards the media and how the media works. So I got some criticism within the guild, so to speak, when I wrote that, but also some acclaim. So this talk today is a first. It's a premiere, world premiere. So hopefully I will be stringent enough. But it's kind of what I often like to talk about is what the media gets wrong about the climate science. But that would be like preaching to the choir, I guess, because you know about those things. So that's what I love to talk about. And then I, as I said, talked several times on the topic of the world being better than we think, and the media's the reason why the media is wrong about that. So this is kind of a hybrid, I guess. So the media is regularly getting, regularly misrepresenting climate science, as you know, and almost always it is towards alarm, sensationalism, and exaggeration. So we have some examples here. This is, of course, from The Guardian. I'm speaking to Ingmar about The Guardian today. I think that's a newspaper that is probably lost. The cause is lost there, but some other newspapers like Washington Post actually had just this week a very interesting article that was critical to the narrative. But this is from The Guardian. And this is from a recent study that was, I think, published a week ago or something like that, about the possibility that the AMOC is gonna stop completely. And I mean, maybe those are not good examples, but those are some examples that I found. Anyway, it's sensationalism. Sensation is good. Sensation sells papers. So why is this? I think I have a few clues as to why this is. And I think you can understand some of them, but some of them might be new to you. We'll see. So the journalists are part of the establishment, and that's something that's probably possibly self-evident, but perhaps not to all. it's not obvious to the journalists themselves many times, I think, because journalists pride themselves of being independent. That's one of the basic tenets of wanting to become a journalist. You're independent, and you want to improve the world, and you want to expose injustices and things like that. But they are actually part of the establishment. So I'd say it's journalists and politicians and also other parts of the establishment. I mean, for instance, the justice system, academia, of course, they're all part of the same, structure, the same main structure, and they're dancing the same dance, so to speak. So they need each other. Politicians need journalists.
And this journalist needs the microphone to go a little bit higher.
Okay, maybe
so we can get the message out.
Yes,
okay,
good.
I'm
good.
sorry for interrupting.
Sorry for having such a weak voice, but I've.
It was my misplacement.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, they need each other. They're kind of enhancing each other's message and purpose of what they're doing. So they don't actually stray outside the approved narratives of contentious topics. And I have to stress here that this is also, of course, not only about the climate issue. There are other topics like this where it's the same, works in the same way. I mean, the legacy media lives up to the name mainstream, meaning that it doesn't stray, like I said, outside the approved narrative. And one example was during the pandemic. I think there are actually very many commonalities between the way that the pandemic and the measures that were taken during the pandemic are like, commonalities between that, how that was depicted in the media and how the climate narrative is depicted in the media. The difference is that the climate thing is it has so long lead times. It's ongoing for decades and decades and decades, and you know that there are always crises in the world, and whenever it's convenient for leaders to lift up a crisis and to tell the not the audience but the voters that they have to pay attention to this particular crisis that is ongoing, then they will focus on that like they did during the pandemic, and that's all that matters during that time. And when that subsides, there is no crisis going on, and for the politicians that's a problem, because if they have a crisis to point to and to spread worry and fear among the voters, among the population, it's easier to be a leader. It's easier to control people, if you want to be a little bit harsh here. And that's good for the possibility of being elected in elections, because you can say that, oh, I'm the one who's going to fix this. Listen to us and my party. We're going to fix this. So that's what they do then. But when these crises subside, these short-lived crises subside, they always have the climate to point to. It always comes back, pops up like a cork. Pop! There's the climate. Don't forget. Never be complacent. Never complacency. Never think that everything's fine, which it mostly is. So that's the difference. But it's very very similar. So they kind of the media sits in the same boat, as we say in Swedish, as the politicians do. Other examples is the big terrorism threat, which was maybe not as clear cut perhaps as the COVID thing and the climate, but you remember, after 9/11 and a few years after that, and some other terrorist attacks, there was this narrative that this was a clear and present danger. It was the most important thing to think about for many years. And then, of course, we had this migration situation, 2015 and 16, and there was another aspect of that, namely that the media, and I know most about the media, of course, in Sweden and some Anglo-Saxon countries like the United States and UK and so on, partly Germany and Spain as well. But anyway, they were in Sweden, in my country, the media follow. I mean, they kind of follow the narrative of the leaders, which in the beginning, late 2015, was largely about being open to these refugees that were coming from Syria and other parts of the Middle East and from Afghanistan and all kinds of places. And we will fix this, and we will have this humanitarian approach. And you remember Angela Merkel saying, "Wir schaffen das," and all of that. But then they changed their tune. Late 2015, early 2016, it was a completely different story. And the media just followed suit. So the media changed their narrative in accordance with the politicians and the leaders. So, and there are also other, topics that I happen to be interested in that are more, perhaps esoteric, like the nature of consciousness and possible lost civilizations and things like that. We don't have to go into that. But anyway, there is a narrative that there's a standard story that is officially approved. It's kind of diffuse how this happens, but there is an officially approved story, and the journalists never really stray outside of that box, but they pride themselves on being independent. They're not really independent. And the basic, in this case, then, the basic premises of the climate transition that the politicians have decided to pursue, that we've heard a lot about, they are never really questioned. Yes, we have a question. Speaking of that,
you said that the narrative changed, but changed to what from 2015 and later? But it's the same narrative now, isn't it?
when it comes to migration.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's not the same. In Sweden, it's not the same.
It's not.
No. Well,
migration is the same.
yeah, but well, we can have a discussion about that. But from my perspective, I think that the mainstream media kind of accepted that now we have to be tough. We have to have stricter borders. No, you don't think so? Okay, fine. I mean, that's fine. We can have different opinions about that. So, how do they show their independence then? Because they want to, because they pride themselves of being independent. Well, it criticizes the establishment and the leaders for not doing more of what they promised to do. And why didn't you do this earlier? And they might even, topple some high-ranking government official or some minister even for not doing what they promised. I mean, so it's like they feel like they're independent in that respect, that they are criticizing that the government doesn't do more of what it says it's going to do. But it would be, in my view, a lot more interesting if they would question the basic premises of this whole thing, the narrative. And I mean, so in this case, in the case of the climate narrative, they of course are critical to they look into the execution of the climate transition. Are we on track to reach net zero by 2045, like in the case of Sweden, etc.? And what's the problem? Well, the problem is, of course, that the first duty of journalism is to find the truth, to tell the truth, find the truth and tell the truth, which every journalist subscribes to, of course, but the truth can lie much deeper than within the framework of what the leaders and government is saying. So this is kind of a subsection to the first one here. Yeah. So who is the underdog and who is part of the establishment today? The decision to pursue this big climate transition has slowly but steadily redistributed society's sources of influence, and we now have kind of big dogs disguised as underdogs, if you will. So the question is, who is David and who is Goliath in today's climate debate? It's a story of good against evil, big against small. And we, in this book, Sven Olof and I, we claim that I mean, there are probably several examples of this, but we put forth the example of Greenpeace. We say that Greenpeace set the standard for this back in the 70s with their spectacular protests against environmental hazards, and there were good intentions behind much of this in the beginning. A good intention behind ending subservience to power and highlighting the Davids in society. Why not? I mean, it's a good thing, and that's very. I mean, that's perfect for journalists who want to improve the world. They can pick up that and write about that and depict this as something fantastic. But the question is, does that still work? I'm not so sure about that, because as we know, the doors are open to the to green activists and people who maybe not call themselves that, but who are green activists. And they have the doors are open to them, but they still depict themselves, portray themselves as underdogs, strangely enough. But people like people in this room are it's a different story. It's much more difficult to get the ear of journalists, of course. Knowledgeable skeptics, as I've called you here. We can take the example, the obvious example of Greta Thunberg. She was invited to speak at the United Nations, I think 4 times. Invited, nota bene. And she was never. I mean, it's one thing that she was never fact-checked. Never fact-checked. She could say just about anything. But of course, I mean, 17-year-old girl, 18-year-old girl, first time she was there. So maybe that would come across as a bit cynical for journalists to fact-check somebody like that. But the fact is that she was actually invited, and the boss of the organization who invited her, Antonio Guterres, he has said, I mean, flagrantly false things about, for instance, extreme weather events. That are, I mean, just as flagrant as anything that Greta Thunberg has said. But he's also never fact-checked, which is very, very strange. So he represents the power establishment, of course, and Thunberg supposedly represents the concerned grassroots. But she is effectively, she supports the power establishment. Somebody talked about the useful idiots, I think. It's a harsh term, but there's something to that, actually. And as you know, also the term skeptic, it used to be, or it's still kind of defined as somebody who is self-aggrandizing and financed by big oil and all that. But we all know in this room that's a false narrative. It's decidedly less comfortable and less conducive for your career, almost regardless of what industry you're in, to express climate skepticism than to go with the mainstream flow. And I know about that. I wasn't openly, kicked out of the newspaper where I was working, Dagens Nyheter, but I had some editors telling me that maybe it's not a good idea if you write those things in that blog that you're writing. So I experienced that. And the problem is, of course, that truth-seeking journalists should expose this upside-down narrative, because it is an upside-down narrative. It's very strange, and it would be incredibly interesting news to read about for people. I mean, the general public would find that super interesting to find out that it is like this. That those who are depicted as underdogs are perhaps those who have more power and who have the ears of the leaders in this world, and not vice versa. But they don't, because the psychological force of this narrative is so strong and keeps it back. And so we have also what time is it now? Okay, I have still some time, of course. Point number 2 here, the main point number 2 is perhaps the most obvious reason why the media works the way it does. News media, primarily. I mean, the media is a big thing, but news media, mainstream news media, it is addicted to drama. And this is important to understand for people who are not journalists, that there is a dramaturgy within journalism, which has always been there. I think it has changed, it has shifted somewhat as to what is considered dramatic and not, but it's still there, it's always been there. And I've chosen these examples here just to show that this was nothing. It was no different 100 years ago. But these examples are also very interesting from the perspective that we have here, because it shows that there was an enormous amount of dramatic weather already, 100 years ago. Of course, we know that. But it was actually big news in this. It's the New York Herald from 1921. Deaths for millions in 1921's record heat wave. It was big. It was a big thing. And it's dramatic. So journalists they love this, of course. This is the media logic, the news dramaturgy. And I call them the dramatic rules. It's, rather show conflict than consensus. Consensus is terrible. You can't write a good headline about consensus, other than if it's a very, very surprising consensus that happens suddenly. Rather black than white. Black and white than gray. Rather drama than normality, or normalcy. I don't know if there are two words for that. Rather victims than equal actors. Victimhood is good. I mean, that's part of it's perfect for the journalistic dramaturgy to have victims. And as you know, it's very easy to point to purported victims in the climate narrative. Poor countries, and poor people, and people living close to water, and there are all sorts of victims that you can kind of point to, which aren't really victims, because in many cases, when it comes to, for instance, people living close to water, they have chosen to do that in our country. So that's the basic principles of the dramatic rules. And then there's something I call the declining misery threshold, which means that as we have heard, the world is getting better. And I worked with Professor Hans Rosling. You know Hans Rosling very well, I'm sure. And I worked with him for a couple of years. I wrote articles in Dagens Nyheter where he was the main source, and I also worked directly together with him for some time. So that was fascinating. That was after I wrote this book I mentioned before. So and the declining misery threshold means that as the world is getting better, we have to. Misery is defined as lesser and lesser things all the time. It doesn't take much for something to be portrayed as misery. And in this case of the climate story, it might be, for instance, you relativize weather-related deaths in history versus weather-related deaths today. They were the numbers were much higher before, but it doesn't matter, because people don't have time to check historic statistics, historic data, and they're not interested in that. They have their lives to live, so they don't check it. So journalists can, and journalists don't either, for the most part. So they can depict these happenings, these events today as being historically dramatic and dangerous, and so that's a relativizing of that. And even different types of disasters. There's still the geophysical disasters are still extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Earthquakes are probably the most dangerous natural catastrophes that we have always been. Not always, because I think if you go back to the 20s and the 30s, floods were actually killing more people, especially in Eastern Asia, than earthquakes. But other than that, earthquakes are still terrible. We had this earthquake, I think, in the beginning of last year in Syria and Turkey, killed 53,000 people. 53,000 people. And you must have many weather disasters to come up to that kind of numbers. But it's not. Even so, I think these latest cyclones, hurricanes in Florida in the United States, have gotten bigger headlines than that earthquake did. So that's the declining misery threshold, and also this last point here, this discounting of misery. It's like I think the sound stopped working. battery maybe?
Try again.
Okay, yeah, yeah, good, good. So there are all kinds of nasty hypotheses of what could happen, and for journalists, it's perfect to write about that before it happens, because it's, you know, you never know if it's not going to happen. It's no fun. So you better write about it now. And there are always thousands of studies showing that something could happen. If this and this and this, if X, Y, and Z, this could happen. So I mean, I had an example of that before concerning the AMOC stopping. So you can always do that. So make the headline before it happens. That's a good one.
I have an example from
Yeah.
the Florida thing.
Yeah.
You can look at this on your laptop.
Yeah,
The news 1 or 2 days before
Yeah.
was top story.
yeah.
Worst hurricane in the history in 100 years.
I know.
And
Yeah,
then it turned out to nothing. It
Yeah.
was still, when it turned out to nothing, it was still the headline
yeah.
that it could have been.
Could have been. Yes, it could. That's very interesting.
So it's so nonsense that it's almost unbelievable.
I think it's the batteries. Yeah.
Let's switch to this one.
Okay. Okay. This is better. Yeah. So that I saw that. So that's a good example. It's a very good example. Here are some other examples. This is a classic. It's it's always 10 years old.
Yeah.
It's always 10 years from now that something's going to happen, or the disaster is going to happen. We have 10 years to stop the catastrophe. And this article on the left here is interesting because that's from 1972, the first big environmental conference in Stockholm, and it's been recurring since then. So, but people forget. You sometimes need to check these things out. To go back to the the old newspapers and see what they wrote. It's very interesting. And also, here we have all kinds of examples to the right here, which basically say, more or less, the 10-year time frame is recurring very, very frequently. Rockström says this. We have less than 10 years. I think that was from 10 years ago. The snow is on its way to disappear forever, and snow on Kilimanjaro. You know what Al Gore has said about these things. Al Gore said all kinds of stupid things 15, 20 years ago. There's still snow there. There's still snow on Kilimanjaro, actually. And the reason why the ice cap on Kilimanjaro is declining is not that it's getting warmer, because it's always sub-zero temperatures. On the top there, it's sublimation. It's because it has been less precipitation for the last, I think, 100 years or something, and that was documented already in the 1800s that it was snowing less and less. So, and ice can go directly from the steady phase to gas phase. So that's one thing. This is another example, of course. I've written about this. Climate refugees, that's a popular theme. And it's, of course, gefundenes Fressen, as the Germans say, for journalists to write about these things, because it's dramatic. You see big flows of people fleeing weather, but they're not, of course. People have always fled singular, events, dramatic events. Of course, a flood, you have to move to another place for some time until the water recedes, and then you go back. And this is what's happening today as well. And then these researchers, they come up with all kinds of ideas about how they can reframe what's actually going on to something connected to the climate. And it can be war, it can be famine, it can be all kinds of political upheavals. It's all about the climate. You know about this. So there could be 1.2 billion climate refugees by 2050. Well, it's safe to write that today. Everybody's going to forget it in a couple of years. So it's safe to write about it. It's about this, write about things before they happen. So the problem is that, of course, that the news is also supposed to be something unexpected, but is yet another climate alarm the unexpected thing today? It's not. So this should be an easy thing to makes some journalists at least convinced that it might even fit into the journalistic dramaturgy, the journalistic narrative, to actually make headlines out of the opposite narrative that people like you and I in this room are conveying, because that's actually the unexpected thing today. So I will try to convey that to my colleagues. Okay, and then there's this number 3, which is, of course, journalists like politicians, but like anybody is human. They are human. It could be, this is something I write about in that apocalypse book that I was talking about. Possibly there was an evolutionary advantage to expect the worst back in the day, tens of thousands of years ago, when we lived in caves. If we did, we don't really know that, but perhaps we lived in caves, and it was a good thing to be good at detecting dangers. The saber-toothed tiger or a fire approaching. If you were good at detecting that, you had a better chance of surviving, of course. And today, in our lives today, in the Western world, in the rich parts of the world, our lives are very, very safe. We almost never encounter true danger, but this lizard brain is still working and scanning for dangers all the time. So it's very, very easy to, and that's you can wake up an editor in the middle of the night and ask her to write a headline about a quick deterioration of something. It's very easy, but ask her to write a headline about a slow improvement, gradual improvement. It's basically virtually impossible. And then the second point here, I think, could be a Western feature. I'm not sure. I've talked to people from the so-called global South about this, and I think there is probably some thing to be said for them being a little bit more optimistic. They're not as pessimistic as people in the West, but I think it's since World War II, after that big disaster, something happened, something changed in the culture in the West, that pessimism has been considered more trustworthy and more serious, not least, more serious than optimism. So that's also something that underlies this reporting. And number 3 is also important because many journalists feel that questioning the alarmists would be morally wrong. We mentioned Greta Thunberg, and young girl concerned. You can't question a person like that, because it is actually very socially risky, to claim, to question claimed misery and claimed victimhood. And that was also very salient during the COVID pandemic, because there were, for instance, not in Sweden as much, but in many other countries, they had these lockdowns and the face mask requirements, and there were many studies showing that those measurements were perhaps even worse than the disease itself. And that would have been, big news, of course, but many journalists, they hesitated to write about that because, well, apparently, what if the virus really is as dangerous as our leaders say? Then it would be very cynical to write about these things and to make headlines about these things. So it is a risk, and that's human, of course. And I want to mention here in this context the research by Andy West. He's a British independent researcher. I think I can't really remember if he's a physicist or engineer or something from the beginning. He has that education, but he has lately been researching, looking into climate catastrophism, and he's written a book called The Grip of Culture. The Grip of Culture. Check that out. That book. It's really good, and he's looked into every country in the world actually, and compared them and seen how severe, how big, how large the climate catastrophism culture is. Not the climate discussion in general, but specifically the climate catastrophism culture. And he has come to the conclusion that it is to be defined as a culture. And he compares with other kinds of cultures Also religions, which is interesting in this context because it's also seen that the climate catastrophism culture is the biggest in the countries that are the most secular. So countries where where religion is still strong, people tend to have that as their culture, their go-to culture is the religion. But in countries like Sweden, Norway, and Holland, and Northern Europe, secular countries, they don't have the religions to go to anymore. So many people feel they adhere to this catastrophism culture, and it's part of a culture is, and a culture cannot survive if it is tainted with facts. Facts destroy cultures. It's not about facts. It's not about facts. It's about community. It's about community, and this is also a human factor. It's very interesting. So check that book out, The Grip of Culture. Very interesting. So, and then finally, I think I have perhaps a couple of more minutes, and we can have some questions. Well, I can also mention the last point here. It's a boring point, but it's true. We all know here that climate science is extremely complex, which is almost never depicted as in the media, because the media can't handle complicated things. News media can't. News magazines sometimes can. So, of course, I mean, very few journalists have the time or the inclination to go to the sources, to the studies themselves. Read a long scientific study takes time, and it's cumbersome. So they don't do that. They go to secondary sources and sometimes even tertiary sources. People like the famous, Johan Rockström. People they know will deliver a one-liner or a couple of one-liners without hesitation, and people who are considered safe. They have been, approved by the general in the general narrative. So they go to those, and they feel I've done my job, and maybe they can talk to 2 or 3 people, but within a very narrow span. It's not like they talk to people like us and then Rockström, but they talk to Rockström and I don't know, Greta Thunberg, and then Rockström is the skeptical person. So, joke aside. So that's easier. And this is something that I've been thinking of lately, and I'm not sure if I'm right here, but I have this suspicion that there might be an Americanization of the media going on in this topic, on this topic, and that climate is ever more becoming a left-right issue, which is a bit crazy because it's science. It should not be a political issue at all. It should be just science, neutral. But it has become this, I think, and we all know that in the United States, this is the case since quite a few years now. Maybe it's also happening here in Europe, and one can ask then why this has become the case. Why is alarmism seen as a left-wing stance, and skepticism then consequently a right-wing stance? Well, I think some other person was talking a little bit about this before, that on the left-hand side it's been, capitalism is the culprit, of course, of everything that's bad. So if capitalism is behind our emissions of carbon dioxide, then this is, of course, something that left-wing people should be critical towards. So that's one explanation why it has become like that. And people on the right are more, or less prone to be critical to economic growth and capitalism and all that. So they're more, inclined to be skeptical to, it can't be that bad because anyway, we need this. We've heard about this being talked about here today and yesterday as well, that we're facing suicide if we're pursuing this climate transition. So we need capitalism to be able to thrive, and that's why it's right. So this is my hypothesis anyway, but I still think it's a bit bizarre that it's a left-wing, left-right thing, and well, this is examples of what I just talked about. The hurricanes is our fault. Well, of course. We wouldn't have any hurricanes if the Nipsey brothers in the 18th century didn't invent the internal combustion engine. Fatties cause global warming. Yes, be very ashamed of yourself. So that's why it's the left, right. So it's been politicized in the US for a long time. Is Europe and the rest of the West or the rich world following suit? I can see those tendencies here, and I'm not sure it's a good thing. I would prefer it to be, journalists, the discussion to become open across the board. But perhaps this is the way it's going to happen, and if it is, well, maybe then eventually it will be across the board. We'll see what happens. But the problem here is, of course, that journalism will be compartmentalized into separate echo chambers. I think might have already happened, but I don't know. Maybe you have some ideas about that. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?